So congratulations on the album,
Thank you.
which I love. In the liner notes you wrote, "In the music of my childhood, I found a key to reinvention."
Mm.
And I'm wondering, at the time that you found that key to reinvention, was that something you were looking for? And by finding it, where did it lead you?
Mm. As a musician, as a violinist, I feel that every day I pick up the instrument is an opportunity to reinvent myself better, better in the image of the instrument, which will always be better than me, better in the image of the composers living or recently dead or long dead, who are often also humbling figures in one's psyche. Um, but also, I was at a point in my life, as I think many of us were, realizing what the pandemic was going to bring about, realizing that this was a global moment of pause, of loss, of transformation. And I'm thinking about, the Hindu pantheon of gods that I grew up worshiping. One of them is Shiva, the destroyer. But actually, the word for destroyer, destruction in Sanskrit, can actually be understood as transformation as well. And so I kind of became obsessed with this idea of change and transformation, physically, metaphysically, spiritually, and of course, through the instrument. And I'm currently reading halfway through Paul Eli's book, Reinventing Bach, which is an incredible, incredible book, about how Bach was constantly reinventing himself and how the players, the musicians who found themselves making Bach's music, especially recording Bach's music, found keys to reinvention for themselves and for the technology that they were using. So, Albert Schweitzer for the LP, and Casals, and Glenn Gould, and Yo-Yo, and so on and so forth. So, I was particularly interested in reinventing myself in the image of Bach, who was reinventing himself 300 years ago to the year in 1720 when he wrote these six pieces for unaccompanied violin. And, this was a moment of intense grief and transformation for Bach. And you hear that in the first sonorities of the first phrase of the first sonata.
Right, right. It's interesting because it seems as though we have an opportunity as a society, as a culture, we have an opportunity to move forward in much better ways. Yet we're bombarded with all these distractions that tell us we're supposed to do things. We should stay in this lane, we should stay in that lane. We should not talk to somebody who disagrees with us. We should be slaves to these things,
Mm.
things like that. What do you hope to accomplish through not just this album, but other work that you do, both in terms of performance and your philanthropic work and your volunteerism? What do
Mm.
you hope to do to sort of get people to realize that getting out of this malaise is the only way we're going to be able to progress as a society?
Mm. One of the images which struck me, really moved me in the beginning of the creation of this whole project was that of a shattered mirror. Um, and I think I had this image at one point when I dropped my phone and it shattered, and I looked at it and I was seeing, in the black of the phone, seeing myself reflected back. And, in a very real way, making music, making art of any kind is like looking into a mirror. I think we make art for ourselves and for the world in order to see ourselves and the world. And in that way, it's sort of the two-way mirror, right? The mirror becomes a lens or it becomes a kaleidoscope where the purpose of making art, my aim in making music is to see myself and see the world and give my listeners, give the people who I engage, not only through the act of playing music, but through the act of storytelling and dialogue and the creation of new work, a new mirror and a new lens. And perhaps the beginnings of the kind of trust that will allow us to let go of that malaise, the kind of trust that will allow us to let go of being informed not only by fear, which I think is evident, but also by everybody else's definition of ourselves, right? What does it mean to write one's own narrative? And what does it mean to kind of really step into that feeling of a kind of imposter syndrome? I hear a lot of my young students, emerging artists of various different, degrees of expertise and presence in the classical music world, talking about imposter syndrome when they want to make something new. I think all creative people encounter this, but the truth is, I think there is no blueprint for creating something new. So therefore, I think we should embrace imposter syndrome, and we should embrace the feeling of, you know, being alone, of of realizing that we're not going to be given the cheat codes to life, and we have to write them ourselves.
Right. How is that received by younger students?
Well, on one hand, I find so much inspiration in talking to young people who are also right outside the sort of institutions of classical music, who are, just starting to knock on the door and then realizing that there might be an entirely different ecosystem that they're interested in or that they can open themselves to. So, on one hand, of course, they're very afraid, and they're very um, unwilling to do something wrong, i.e., live a narrative different than one that's been prescribed for them, often by their teachers, but also by a system, a system of art making and of commodification. And on the other hand, I actually find a lot of inspiration from seeing the dedication of young people on platforms like Instagram and TikTok and various social media platforms, which are incredibly creative. And of course, they start off being very creative and they fall into a script and a narrative and an algorithm that is also set for them. So, it's this constant process of reinvention, coming back to the theme of reinvention, that I think young people are um, living, living in their daily lives. Being a young person in the world perhaps is inherently creative.
Well, and being a musician or an artist is an inherently a political act, isn't it?
Mm, it certainly is because, in a sense, it is deeply vulnerable to continue to live into one's own authenticity, right? And it is uh, deeply vulnerable to choose not to subscribe to someone else's either or, right? To actually see the nuance. I think it's an incredibly brave thing to be nuanced. It's an incredibly brave thing to be able to uh, not cancel each other. I've recently been really obsessed with the metaphor of kintsugi, the Japanese art of remaking pottery. And sort of reading early on that kintsugi is very similar to the way that broken bones are healed. That actually, you have to the fracture happens, but you have to kind of stay at the fracture, and that point of fracture then becomes inflamed. You have an immune response to it where it's incredibly painful. The healing process is incredibly painful because you have to pay attention to the fracture. And I feel like we're not healing if we're not actually in pain. What a metaphor that is.
Right, absolutely. Now you were talking about the commodification of music, and you had a front row seat. All right, well maybe you were four rows back, but you were on the aisle, as it were. But you got to see soloists, whether it was your instrument or any number of other instruments, come through there. Some fast rising stars who maybe have faded out, and some legends who have been through. So certainly you were in a position where you saw that the traditional route was the way to acquire a certain level of fame or success. If you look at this album, I would assume that there would be a lot of people who would have said, this isn't that path. So how important was it for you to take a risk and to define yourself by following your instincts as opposed to following a traditional path to success?
Hmm. Well, I think that for much of my life, I have been incredibly lucky to have lived many different iterations of the traditional pathways of success. I won my first audition that I ever took for the Philharmonic when I was 19. I still don't know how that happened. Uh, I was incredibly lucky to also see what traditional success looked like from the perspective of being in a Harvard neuroscience lab and seeing what the top scientists were studying. And I think that whether we're looking at neuroscience or traditional classical music and looking at the greatest soloists of the time, there is a sort of externally imposed assumption that that person has kind of fit into a niche and has risen exponentially because the niche exists. Whereas when I actually have conversations with, not even neuroscientists or soloists, but even entrepreneurs or creators of various different kinds, or people engaged in social justice or political advocacy, again, everyone is writing their own script when they arrive at a place of deep resonance with the world. And so I'm really interested in resonance as opposed to validation. And I think that we spend a lot of time, again, living by someone else's narrative, living by someone else's script. And when I look at, writers, oh my gosh, great writers like Milan Kundera, or the great storytellers, Dostoevsky, Kafka, um, when they, right on my desk right now is Elie Wiesel's Night, because I'm thinking about night as a theme for an upcoming project. When Elie Wiesel was talking about night, he said, if you read my book, good for you. I had to write it because I had to write it. I had to make this album because I had to make this album. And that is an incredibly, again, a vulnerable act, because as an artist, immediately one asks oneself, well, is this just inherently narcissistic? Am I being selfish by imposing my will upon the most precious resource that any human being has, which is their time, right, and their attention? But hopefully, what any creative endeavor accomplishes is the ability to create a portal, that mirror or lens of one's attention and time, to be able to give oneself a glimpse to say, you know what, I have the right to create something too. I have a voice. I have something to say. We all have something to say. Whether we're going to sit ourselves down and apply ourselves to the craft of creating, manifesting something from that capacity, is the work before us.
How much is that resonance that you were speaking about deepened when you were able to collaborate with the person you've chosen to share your life with?
Hmm. Uh, so I have worked very closely with Reena, um, gosh, really since 2015, 2016. Uh, and being able to see each other so closely, see ourselves reflected in each other, see our histories and our families' histories reflected in each other. But also for me personally, to find a fulfillment of a very long desire of learning my own lineage's tradition, rich tradition, millennia old tradition of music, Hindustani music. Um, uh, has been another key to reinvention. When the violin came out of a work that Reena first wrote for choir and cello. And it was, a setting of these words, this poem by Hafiz, the ancient Sufi mystic. Um, and especially working with a composer is really really profound, because I feel like Reena's work, and any composer's work, is to take the unmanifest and bring it as close to manifestation as possible, right? And then the performer's job is to undo it, right? To take what is manifest, perhaps in Western classical music, what's manifested on the page, and turn it back into expression, right? Turn it back into that sort of unmanifested, um, temporal, fleeting offering that music is. And I feel incredibly lucky that every morning coffee and meal and conversation that I get to have with Reena is a kind of iterative process of that give and take.
Well, in the Hafiz text that inspired, you know, the piece that she wrote, that is also the title of the album, there's a line that says that forgiving your past leads to singing. How much forgiving of your past have you had to do to get to this place where you could sing with your violin on an album like this?
You know, the concept of forgiveness is such a rich one, because for me, and I think for a lot of classically trained artists, we are so humbled by the act of playing our instrument that we're always looking forward, where we're always looking for the thing to do better. And so it's easy uh, to only be obsessed with that forward sort of trajectory. But forgiveness, and in a strange way, reinvention, requires us to look back, and to look back in our lives, and to understand ways in which we have been hurt, ways in which we have hurt others, ways in which we have lived somebody else's narrative. Um, and forgiveness is, in a sense, an opportunity to take one's identity from something more than those hurts, something more than those wounds. And so, the first thing that sort of manifested for me technically as a violinist was that, all of this album has been recorded using a different kind of bow than the typical modern bow. And I promise that this is not just violinist shop talk, because the implement that I use is actually a replica of an 18th century Italian Baroque bow. And this bow is much less robust. It's much more fragile. It's softer. It dances more. It has more idiosyncrasies. It's not as uh, powerful and as steady as a modern bow. And of course, I grew up playing on a modern bow, but I had had some intersection with playing on a Baroque bow earlier in my life when I was a student at Yale, and picking the Baroque bow back up was part of this process of learning how to sing in a new way, learning how to speak through my instrument in a new way, because this bow dances. The point of a lot of Baroque music is that it's rooted in rhetoric. It's rooted in the rhythm of speaking. And that's a through line of this album. The poem of Hafiz, but also the work by Esa-Pekka Salonen, Lachen Verlernt, which is inspired by Pierrot and Arnold Schoenberg's Sprechstimme, this kind of half speaking, half singing texture from Pierrot. Um, and so it kind of begged this question from me of, what are you saying? When you're playing, what are you saying? What are you really getting at? So just to come back kind of full circle, I reinvented my technique of how I approach the violin. Um, and I think for the first time, I was learning how to dance and sing with the instrument, as opposed to dance and sing against the instrument.
It also sounds like by that choice of bow that you're also learning how to sing and dance with a greater sense of fragility. and
Craig,
vulnerability.
Craig, I missed the first part of your question because my internet went out. Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
No, I mean, it seems like if, not only are you allowing to sing and dance, but using, you know, the bow that you're using, a more Baroque bow, you're also leaving yourself open to fragility and vulnerability on a greater level.
And that for me was key to understanding Bach at that time, in 1720. We have this image, at least I was kind of inscribed, this image of Bach was inscribed upon me when I was very young, of being unassailable, bulletproof, and that you played Bach with this sort of like stentorian maestoso, everything was confident and big and bold. And somehow returning to this original implement and also playing from Bach's own handwriting, playing from the autograph of the score, it shows not only how beautiful and tender this writing is, but how uh, caring and fragile, and kind of like setting something up that he wasn't sure what it was going to be. And of course this is an era before publishing, right? So Bach wrote this music not knowing where it was going to go, and a lot of historians have actually said, he may have never meant for it to be performed. These weren't concert pieces. Of course, the cantatas were, the passions were, these were concert pieces, but works like Well-Tempered Clavier, that was essentially written while he was incarcerated by the Duke of Weimar, or pieces like the Sei Solo, these pieces for solo violin or solo cello, were written in moments of solitude for him. Um, so that for me was also a way of inhabiting the fragility of that moment of intense grief that Bach was experiencing, but also a way of connecting with the fragility that the world was and is still experiencing, but especially was experiencing in March 2020 when the seeds of this project took hold. Um, what did it mean to actually approach Bach from the personal and metaphysical context in which those pieces emerged? And that for me was silence, fragility, and not confidence.
And it's interesting to get all of those points across, even just musically, without text and things like that, requires that people listen. And it feels like listening is an art form that is fast fading into a dying art form.
Mm.
And I'm wondering, as a musician who relies on people to listen, what your thoughts are, or concerns, or maybe hopes, if there are those, that I'm wrong.
For me, listening is an act of love. And I am taught this every time I visit the community of people who have become a family to me in Skid Row. In fact, several years ago, there was a man named Brian Palmer who I became quite close with. He was uh, a member of a choir in Skid Row, and he was the one who said, one act of love I know for sure is to listen. And where we listen, how we place our attention in the world is really where we direct the most precious resource we have, our time, our focus, our attention. And it's not only that music and art are being commodified, but our very attention itself is the greatest commodity that everyone seems to be bidding for. And so listening to music, certainly having this album listened to, even a track of the album listened to, is something that I know I could never take for granted. Anyone who has taken the time to listen to this album has given the most precious thing that they can possibly give, and I am incredibly honored and grateful that that has happened. And in terms of the kind of social transformation that I have witnessed as a musician, in continuing to make an offering of music to the world, is that I play differently when I play for an audience of people I love. Uh, the only person who was in the room besides my engineer when I recorded the Bach on this album is a man to whom this album is dedicated. His name is Duane Garcia. And Duane was incarcerated at Solano prison here in California for over 30 years. And he's someone who I became very close with in Skid Row. Duane still lives in Skid Row. He was a participant of programs at a reentry center. He's now been housed in single room occupancy housing. He's an incredible painter and an artist. And throughout the pandemic, I would call in to, from this room where I'm sitting right now, to Duane's reentry center. And sometimes it would just be me and him. And I would play Bach for him. And sometimes I would even stop in the middle of the movement just to make sure that he was still there, that the internet hadn't frozen, and that we could still talk to each other. And so Duane became my mirror and my lens. He became this point of exchange where the fact that he showed up was not just a lifeline for him; it was a lifeline for me. Uh, and I think that we can begin to understand that listening is the lifeline that we need now. Listening is the corrective experience to this attention economy. And that when we listen to music, whether we listen in the solitude of our homes and we're listening to recorded music, which was certainly the offering that Glenn Gould made, or we listen in the concert hall when we're lucky enough to enter that space of transcendence, we are actually offering ourselves a profound act of love because we are seeing ourselves offered. We are seeing the most precious part of ourselves kind of magnified in expression, right? So remember that we have the capacity to feel something again, and that if we have the capacity to feel something, we have the capacity to create something as well.
Right. Well, that leads in perfectly to the last thing I wanted to ask you. Hafiz wrote that the heart is a 1,000-string instrument that can only be tuned with love.
Mm.
How does your 4-stringed instrument allow you not to just express love, but to receive it, and through that have an impact on the world in which you live?
What a gorgeous question, Greg. I recorded this album in a very special sanctuary here in Pasadena, where I live, at All Saints Church. And as a musician, as a violinist trained in conservatories, we're often told how to play almost in a kind of one-dimensional way. It's always sort of like from ourselves outward. Do this with the instrument so that the audience will hear that. Um, and it often relies on the sort of one-way unilateral projection of expression. When I enter All Saints, um, even though the church was empty, I knew that I was in communion with something more than myself. When I entered that space, it wasn't just about the acoustic, it was a kind of spiritual acoustic. When I played a note, it was not just an act of putting a note into the space, but using my ears to listen to how that space was giving something back to me. And then that place of exchange, that moment of exchange and reciprocity is created in a mutual way such that I relax, I open, I'm more able to be vulnerable. And I kind of allow that heart to open up just wide enough so that it's exposed 6 feet to the microphone that's receiving what happens to be coming out of my instrument. So that point of mutual reciprocity and exchange makes playing music both an act of giving, but more importantly, an act of receiving, just as you've put it so beautifully. And that's kind of become a central tenet to the next step of this project that I have before me, which is, of course, to continue recording the sonatas and partitas of Bach, kind of informed by contemporary works, because I also think there is a giving and receiving when it comes to how we tell the story of history, right? There's a giving and receiving to how Bach has shaped music that has come after. But in a very real way, the new music that Reena wrote in the ancient raga of Charukeshi helps me recontextualize Bach, and it helps me recontextualize his humanity. So, how can we use music and the reciprocity, the mutuality born of artistic expression to recontextualize and perhaps forgive and find a new narrative in the histories that are often forced upon us?
And something we sorely need right now.